The video uses AI voice images combined with manual editing. All content is fictional and for entertainment purposes only. Wishing you a relaxing listening experience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Boston penthouse, blurring the glittering, unforgiving skyline into a smudge of dull gold and charcoal. Adriano Romano, the undisputed head of the Romano syndicate, stood perfectly still, with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His dark eyes reflected the storm outside, a perfect mirror to the tempest of stress churning within him. At 32, Adriano possessed a face carved from cold marble, a sharp, unforgiving jaw, piercing obsidian eyes that seemed to strip people of their secrets, and an ever-present, bruising shadow of exhaustion beneath them. He controlled massive shipping ports from New York to Halifax, sprawling real estate empires, and the unseen, ruthless underworld of the East Coast. When he spoke, politicians listened. When he frowned, rivals disappeared. Yet, standing in the center of his own fortress-like home, he felt entirely powerless against a simple, lingering ghost. The warm, fragrant memory of his late mother. Behind him, standing in a neat, trembling row in his massive, state-of-the-art kitchen, were 10 women. They had been sent by an elite, exorbitant culinary agency, though they looked far more suited for a Milan runway than a hot, greasy stove. Dressed in pristine, tailored chef whites that clung desperately to their impossibly thin frames, they wore heavy, flawless makeup and towering stilettos that clicked nervously against the imported Italian tile. They were holding polished santoku knives, like foreign artifacts they were afraid might spontaneously detonate. Adriano's jaw tightened until his teeth ground together. He didn't want a trophy to parade in front of his associates. He wanted a private chef who could recreate the soul-warming, rustic, unapologetically rich Italian meals of his childhood, the only thing that offered him a fleeting moment of peace in a life built on violence, betrayal, and relentless paranoia. "Mr. Romano," the nervous agency representative squeaked, aggressively adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses and dabbing sweat from his pale forehead. "These are our absolute top-tier culinary artists. Svetlana here specializes in molecular gastronomy foams and edible nitrogen clouds, and Valentina does a magnificent, deconstructed, gold-leaf Wagyu tartare paired with a balsamic caviar." Adriano slowly turned around. He didn't say a word at first, but the sheer, oppressive weight of his presence seemed to suck the oxygen directly from the room. The women flinched as his gaze swept over them. I asked. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. For someone who can cook, real honest food, not avant-garde art projects, not foam that tastes like flavored air. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, towering over the line of terrified models. Which one of you knows how to properly bloom garlic in a pan of cold olive oil, bringing it up to heat without burning it dry? Which of you can make a pork ragout that simmers on a back burner for 10 hours until the meat melts into the sauce? The silence that stretched across the kitchen was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Svetlana's trembling hand betrayed her. She dropped her knife. It clattered violently against the marble floor, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet penthouse. Adriano closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose as a familiar, sharp headache began throbbing at his temples. "Get them out, all of them. You are all fired before you even began." "But sir, the contract," the agent started, his voice cracking. "Now," Adriano growled, turning his back to the room and staring out into the driving rain. As the flurry of panicked high heels clacked frantically toward the private elevator, the heavy oak doors of the service entrance at the far end of the kitchen swung open. A young woman stumbled in, wrestling with two massive, overflowing canvas bags of groceries that looked heavy enough to snap a lesser person's wrists. She wasn't a model. Leonie Muller was a woman of soft, inviting curves and sturdy, undeniable grace. She had messy chestnut hair tied back in a hurried, utilitarian bun, and a stark smudge of white flour dusted the cheek of her otherwise bare, expressive face. She wore a simple, faded linen apron over a comfortable, oversized knit sweater and practical, non-slip clogs that squeaked faintly on the tile. She paused in the doorway, taking in the bizarre scene of the fleeing, glamorous models and the terrifying, broad-shouldered man standing by the window. "Oh," Leonie said, her voice surprisingly steady and rich, though she was panting slightly from the sheer weight of the bags dragging down her arms. "Am I late for the audition? The subway was delayed at Park Street, and I had to stop at the North End open-air market because the hothouse produce at the corporate store you assigned was an absolute insult to agriculture." Adriano turned, his dark gaze sweeping over her with clinical detachment. She was undeniably chubby, entirely ordinary in her presentation, devoid of a drop of makeup, and completely, bafflingly unfazed by the thick tension radiating in the room. "The audition is over," he said coldly, turning back to the window. "Leave." Leonie didn't move. She looked at the sterile, untouched kitchen, the gleaming stainless steel that had never seen a true mess, and then back at his broad, dismissive back. "With all due respect, Mr. Romano, I have 50 pounds of imported San Marzano tomatoes, fresh, earthy rosemary, and a beautiful cut of bone-in veal in these bags. I am not hauling it back out into the rain. I'm cooking." Before Adriano could press the security buzzer to order his armed guards to physically throw her out, Leonie marched straight to the massive marble counter. She dropped the heavy bags with a definitive thud and began moving with the practiced, fluid, and mesmerizing efficiency of a seasoned veteran. She didn't look at him again. She ignited the heavy gas stove with a sharp click hiss, pulled a massive cast-iron Dutch oven from the hanging rack, and poured a generous, unmeasured glug of deep green olive oil into it. Adriano watched her, mesmerized despite his rising anger. He intended to shout, to assert his dominance, to remind her exactly whose home she was standing in. But then it happened. The sharp, pungent scent of fresh garlic hitting warm oil filled the air, hissing delightfully. She crushed a thick sprig of fresh rosemary between her bare palms to violently release the essential oils, tossing it into the pot along with a hefty pinch of crushed red pepper flakes. The aroma blossomed instantly, hitting Adriano like a physical, heavy blow directly to the chest. It wasn't just a good smell, it was a time machine. It was the exact, unmistakable scent of his mother's tiny, sunlit kitchen in Sicily, a smell of safety and unconditional love he hadn't experienced in 20 long, bloody years. He slowly walked toward the kitchen island, his footsteps completely silent. He stood watching as Leonie expertly seared the veal, her face a mask of absolute focus, her hands moving with a deep, reverent love for the ingredients. She was completely in her element, a sovereign queen in her domain, utterly oblivious to the dangerous, lethal Mafia Boss standing mere inches away from her cutting board. Within the hour, the kitchen was transformed from a sterile showroom into a warm, chaotic haven. She plated a small, steaming portion of a rustic, wildly rich stew and slid the heavy ceramic bowl across the marble counter toward him. "Taste it," she challenged gently, wiping her hands on her stained apron. Her warm, hazel eyes met his dark, cold ones without a single ounce of fear or hesitation. "Then tell me to leave." Adriano picked up the silver fork. His hand, which never trembled while holding a loaded weapon or ordering a man's end, shook slightly as he lifted the meat. He took a bite. The rich, deep, earthy flavors, the perfectly tender meat that yielded instantly, the nostalgic warmth of the seasoned broth. It forcefully shattered a massive, icy wall inside him that he had spent decades meticulously building. The silence in the room changed from tense to reverent. He looked at the curvy, flour-dusted woman who had just nonchalantly performed a miracle. "You're hired," Adriano said, his voice unusually thick, struggling to clear the emotion from his throat. He quickly recovered his mask, his eyes hardening. "But if you ever speak to me with that defiant tone again, you'll regret it." Leonie calmly picked up her empty grocery bags, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. "I only speak the truth, Mr. Romano. If you don't like it, stay out of my kitchen." As Adriano turned away, stunned by her audacity, a sudden, frantic pounding on the penthouse's outer reinforced steel door echoed through the vast space. It was instantly followed by the terrifying, synchronized metallic shing of his bodyguards drawing their weapons in the hallway. The warm sanctuary of the kitchen was instantly breached by the cold, violent reality of his world, leaving Leonie staring at the door, her heart skipping a beat. The chaos at the penthouse door the previous night had ultimately been a false alarm, a drunken, wealthy neighbor stumbling blindly onto the wrong private floor. But it was more than enough for Adriano to realize that downtown Boston was far too volatile right now. The rival Moretti family, emboldened by rumors of a rat in Adriano's camp, was making aggressive, bloody moves on his southern port territories, and the tension was bleeding perilously into his personal life. By dawn, under the cover of thick fog, Adriano had rapidly relocated himself, his core tactical security team, and his bewildered newly hired chef to the Romano ancestral estate, nestled deep in the snowy, isolating, and heavily wooded Berkshire Mountains. The estate was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of dark, unforgiving stone, wrought iron gates, and towering ancient pines that seemed to deliberately swallow the sunlight before it could touch the ground. For Leonie, stepping out of the armored SUV and feeling the biting mountain wind against her cheeks, felt terribly like stepping into a beautiful, frozen prison. "Welcome to the compound, Miss Muller." Vincenzo, Adriano's silver-haired, scar-faced underboss, said with a tight, humorless nod. His eyes were cold, assessing her as if she were a potential threat rather than a cook. He handed her a stiff, laminated card. "These are the rules of the house. Memorize them immediately. You do not wander the East Wing. You do not ask questions about the black vehicles arriving in the middle of the night. And you never, under any circumstances, enter Mr. Romano's private study. Breaches of these rules are not met with verbal warnings." Leonie took the card, her fingers brushing the cold plastic, refusing to let him intimidate her. "I'm here to cook, Vincenzo, not to snoop through your boss's secrets. Just point me to the kitchen and stay out of my way." If the Boston penthouse kitchen was sterile, the estate's kitchen was a vast, forgotten graveyard. It was massive, outfitted with the finest commercial-grade appliances money could buy, but it felt terribly cold and profoundly unloved. Thick layers of dust coated the grand, hammered copper pots hanging from the ceiling rack. The massive walk-in refrigerator, large enough to hold a small car, held only imported bottled water, dusty bottles of expensive champagne, and a few sad, wrinkled apples. Leonie dropped her bags onto the central butcher block island, rolled up the sleeves of her sweater with a determined huff, and got straight to work. For the next 8 grueling hours, Leonie entirely transformed the space. She scrubbed the granite counters until they gleamed, seasoned the rusted cast-iron skillets with oil and heat until they were non-stick, and unpacked the massive crates of supplies she had demanded Vincenzo source from local winter farmers on the drive up. She filled the sterile air with the deeply comforting scent of roasting garlic, proofing baking yeast, and rich, simmering chicken stock made from scratch. The cold, haunting, fortress-like estate began to smell, for the very first time in years, like an actual home. Adriano spent the entire day locked inside his dimly lit study, aggressively coordinating a defensive, multi-layered strategy against the Morettis. He was running purely on black, bitter coffee and raw adrenaline, his famously cold temper fraying dangerously with every passing hour. When the massive antique grandfather clock in the hall struck 8, a soft, tentative knock echoed at his heavy oak door. He yanked it open forcefully, expecting one of his lieutenants with more bad news about the docks. Instead, he found Leonie standing there, holding a heavy silver serving tray. She looked entirely exhausted. Her faded apron was now stained with bright tomato sauce. A prominent smudge of flour rested on her nose. But her hazel eyes were bright and unwavering. "You skipped lunch," she said simply, stepping smoothly past him into the forbidden, highly classified territory of his study before his brain could register the intrusion. She bypassed the seating area and set the tray directly onto his sprawling mahogany desk, placing it right over a highly sensitive topographical map detailing illicit shipping routes. "I told you the rules," Adriano snapped, closing the door and spinning around, his voice a dangerous low whisper. "No one enters this room. Not ever. And the human body needs actual sustenance to function, Mr. Romano," Leonie countered calmly, completely ignoring his dark glare as she lifted the polished silver dome. The thick, intoxicating scent of wild mushroom risotto, heavily rich with truffle oil and freshly grated parmesan, filled the tense, masculine air of the room. Alongside it sat a perfectly pan-crusted piece of sea bass and a crystal glass poured high with a robust Barolo. You can't successfully run an empire, legitimate or otherwise, if you're passing out from low blood sugar. Eat the food. Adriano stared at her, genuinely stunned by her sheer audacity. Grown men, hardened criminals, cowered before him. His enemies feared his mere shadow. Yet this ordinary, chubby woman in a stained apron was scolding him with the exact tone of a disappointed mother dealing with a petulant child. He wanted to rage, to throw the heavy silver tray against the stone wall to prove his authority, but his treacherous stomach betrayed him with a loud, demanding rumble. He sat down heavily in his leather chair, rubbing his tired eyes, and picked up the fork. The very first bite was a revelation. It was highly sophisticated, yet deeply, primitively comforting. A masterful, perfect balance of earthy and rich flavors that coated his tongue. He ate in absolute silence, the tense, harsh lines of his face slowly softening as the warmth spread through his chest. Leonie stood quietly by the heavy door, watching him not with fear, but with a look of quiet, maternal satisfaction. When he finished every last bite, he pushed the empty plate away, deliberately refusing to look at her, terrified she might see the rare vulnerability swimming in his dark eyes. It was adequate, he lied smoothly, his voice returning to its customary chill. "Leave the tray. Get out." Leonie didn't take the bait. She didn't flinch at his dismissal. Instead, she smiled softly, seeing right through his abrasive armor. "You're welcome, Adriano." She turned and left, closing the heavy door softly behind her. Adriano froze entirely. No one had called him by his first name, casually and without an undercurrent of fear or manipulation, since his mother died. He looked down at the empty plate, a strange, terrifying warmth blooming rapidly in his chest, a feeling far more dangerous to him than any bullet. But his rare moment of peace was violently shattered when his encrypted desk phone buzzed. He picked it up, listening to Vincenzo's grim, panicked voice on the other end. "Boss, we have a massive problem. The Moretti's just heavily armed a crew and intercepted our primary weapons shipment at the docks. And worse, I think someone on the inside gave them the exact schedule. A violent, unyielding winter storm descended upon the Berkshires by nightfall, aggressively burying the estate under 3 feet of heavy snow and entirely cutting off the main access roads to the outside world. The wind howled against the thick stone walls and rattled the heavy glass like a pack of starving wolves trying to get in. Inside, the atmosphere was just as volatile and suffocating. The undeniable revelation of a high-level mole operating within the Romano syndicate had cast a dark, suffocating shadow of extreme paranoia over the entire household. Adriano had spent the last 3 grueling days relentlessly interrogating his own men in the basement, his demeanor growing colder, sharper, and more terrifyingly detached with each passing, sleepless hour. Leonie keenly felt the tension seeping through the floorboards. The armed guards stationed around the kitchen were jumpy, their eyes darting at shadows, their hands constantly hovering near their holstered weapons. But while the house braced for a war, Leonie found her necessary sanctuary in the steady, predictable rhythm of cooking. Bread dough became her therapy, her stress relief against the madness surrounding her. It was 2 a.m. The storm was still raging violently outside, violently rattling the heavy window panes of the kitchen. Leonie couldn't sleep. The heavy silence of the house was too loud. She padded softly down the grand staircase to the kitchen in her oversized, comfortable sweatpants and a worn-out college hoodie, tying her chestnut hair into a messy, securing knot. She needed to knead. She pulled out a massive, worn wooden bowl, methodically combining flour, warm water, salt, and her precious, bubbling sourdough starter. As she rhythmically pushed, folded, and stretched the heavy dough, she lost herself entirely in the repetitive grounding motion. Do you ever actually sleep? Or are you secretly a machine powered entirely by carbohydrates? Leonie gasped, her hands freezing in the dough, and spun around. Adriano was leaning heavily against the archway of the door, completely shrouded in the dim shadows of the hall. He wore dark, tailored slacks and a black silk dress shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, the tie discarded. He looked utterly exhausted. Deep, dark circles hollowed his eyes, and the usual sharp, dominant set of his broad shoulders was visibly slouched under an invisible, crushing weight that seemed to be suffocating him. "I could easily ask you the exact same thing," Leonie replied, her heart pounding slightly against her ribs. Surprisingly, it wasn't from fear, but from witnessing the raw, incredibly unguarded look of defeat on his normally stoic face. She turned back to her dough, offering him a sense of normalcy. Baking requires a lot of patience. It absolutely can't be rushed. When I can't sleep, it reminds me that some things in life just need time to develop on their own. Adriano walked slowly, almost hesitantly, into the warm kitchen, the thick scent of active yeast and warm flour wrapping around him like a desperately needed comforting blanket. He stopped on the opposite side of the butcher block island, crossing his arms and watching her flour-dusted hands fiercely work the dough. "I don't have the luxury of time, Leonie," he said, his voice a low, raspy gravel that betrayed his bone-deep fatigue. "In my world, waiting gets you killed. Giving people the benefit of the doubt gets you killed. Trust gets you killed." Leonie paused her kneading, resting her hands on the counter, and looked directly up at him. She didn't see the terrifying mafia Don the world feared. She saw a man who was deeply, painfully isolated, carrying a massive, bloody burden he had inherited and never truly asked for. "You think someone inside this very house betrayed you," she stated softly, factually. Adriano's eyes snapped sharply to hers, a sudden, bright flash of danger returning to his posture. "You listen at doors? I don't have to. The guards are tense enough to snap. You look like you haven't slept in a week, and you jump at shadows. It doesn't take a criminal mastermind to read the room." She pushed the heavy bowl of dough aside, wiping her hands, and walked confidently over to the massive commercial espresso machine. She quickly brewed a large cup of decaffeinated chamomile tea, stirring in a generous spoonful of raw, local honey, and slid the warm ceramic mug across the marble to him. "No caffeine for you. You need rest, Adriano. Desperately." He stared down at the mug as if it were a trap. "I can't afford to rest. If I close my eyes for even a minute, the wolves close in. Even wolves need to sleep eventually," she said gently, her voice a soothing balm in the quiet room. "You can't protect anyone or run this empire you've built if you break yourself into 1,000 unfixable pieces." Adriano slowly picked up the mug. The gentle warmth of it seeped into his perpetually cold hands. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound in the vast room was the violent howling wind outside and the low, rhythmic hum of the massive refrigerators. "Why aren't you afraid of me, Leonie?" he asked suddenly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity that made her breath hitch. "Everyone else is. They physically shake when I enter a room. They lie to please me. But you argue with me over vegetables. You force-feed me. You look at me like I'm just a normal man." Leonie leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest, holding his intense gaze. "Because I've spent my entire life being instantly judged by my physical appearance. People look at my weight and immediately assume I'm lazy or stupid or invisible. I know exactly what it's like to be seen only as a flat stereotype. I look at you, and yes, I see the immense power, the violence, and the danger. But I also see a man who deeply misses his mother's cooking. I see a man who is exhausted by his own life." Adriano was stunned into absolute silence. Her sharp emotional intelligence, her profound, unapologetic empathy, pierced right through his impenetrable armor like a heated blade. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach across the counter, to touch her flour-dusted hand, to feel if her skin was as incredibly warm as her words. He took a hesitant half-step forward, the physical space between them suddenly crackling with an unspoken, incredibly heavy romantic tension. Before he could bridge the gap, the kitchen service door swung open violently, banging against the wall. Vincenzo stood there, freezing snow melting rapidly off his heavy tactical coat, his scarred face paler than usual. "Boss," Vincenzo breathed heavily, completely ignoring Leonie's shocked presence. "The perimeter laser alarms on the south ridge just tripped. Someone cut through the reinforced fence. We are under attack." The quiet estate erupted instantly into highly organized, terrifying chaos. Silent, strobing red alarms blared through the dark corridors, bathing the kitchen in a harsh, pulsing crimson light. Adriano's demeanor shifted in a microsecond. The tired, vulnerable man who had been seeking comfort in the kitchen completely vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless, calculating commander of the Romano Syndicate. He smoothly drew a matte black, heavy-caliber firearm from a hidden ankle holster and turned to Leonie, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth. "Vincenzo, get her down to the panic room in the sub-basement." "Now," Adriano ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "No!" Leonie protested instinctively, grabbing the heavy edge of the counter. "I have sourdough rising, and I'm in the middle of prepping the massive summit dinner for tomorrow." Adriano closed the distance between them in a flash, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was incredibly firm, but surprisingly careful not to bruise her. He leaned in close, and the sharp, metallic scent of his gun mingled with his expensive cedar cologne, overwhelming her senses. "Listen to me very carefully, Leonie. If the Morettis breach the walls of this house, they will indiscriminately kill everyone they find. You are going into that room, and you will not come out until I personally open the door. Do you understand me?" Looking into his lethal, unyielding eyes, for the very first time, Leonie felt the true, chilling reality of the monster he had to be to survive. She nodded silently, terrified. Vincenzo roughly grabbed her arm and rushed her down a hidden, winding concrete staircase located behind the dry pantry, locking her inside a small, windowless, reinforced steel room. She sat there huddled in the dark for 3 agonizing, terrifying hours, listening to the muffled, chaotic shouts and the distant, terrifying pop-pop-pop of heavy gunfire echoing through the floors above. Her heart ached fiercely, surprisingly, not just for her own physical safety, but for Adriano's. The thought of him bleeding out on the floor upstairs made her physically nauseous. When the heavy steel door finally groaned and clicked open, Adriano stood in the doorway. He had a shallow, bloody cut across his sharp cheekbone, and his expensive silk shirt was ruined with dirt and grime. But he was alive. He let out a long, ragged breath he seemed to have been holding since he locked her in, extending a large hand to help her up from the cold floor. "It's over. They were just an advance scouting party trying to test our response time. We handled it, but the midnight attack had severe, lingering consequences." The next evening, Adriano was scheduled to host Don Salvatore, the oldest, most traditional, and most powerful boss of the Northern Allied families. Securing Salvatore's firm alliance was the only possible way to stop an all-out, bloody street war with the Morettis. The dinner had to be absolutely flawless. It was a vital show of strength, wealth, and stability. 2 hours before the high-stakes dinner, Leonie entered the massive walk-in fridge to meticulously retrieve the highly expensive imported white truffles and the beautifully dry-aged Wagyu beef she had prepared for the main course. As she stepped inside, her heart plummeted violently into her stomach. The fridge was warm. The heavy power cord had been deliberately, cleanly severed. The temperature had risen to room level hours ago. The priceless meat was entirely spoiled, turning a sickening, sluggish grey, and the incredibly delicate earthy truffles were completely ruined by the humid condensation. Panic seized her throat. The mole. Someone deeply embedded inside the house had intentionally sabotaged the dinner to deeply humiliate Adriano in front of the highly traditional Don Salvatore, showing him as a leader who couldn't even control his own kitchen. Adriano walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, dressed in an immaculate, razor-sharp black tuxedo, looking like a terrifying dark prince. He saw her pale, horrified face, and the ruined ingredients spread on the counter. "What happened?" he demanded, the air chilling around him. "Sabotage," Leonie whispered, her voice trembling slightly with anger and fear. "The main course is completely ruined. I have absolutely nothing worthy to serve a don of his stature. I have no time to prep anything of this fine dining caliber." Adriano's jaw clenched so hard she thought she heard his back teeth grind. He slammed his large fist onto the marble counter, a terrifying sudden display of rage that made the hanging pots rattle. "They want me to look weak, to serve him scraps like a peasant. If he feels disrespected, the alliance is entirely dead." Leonie looked down at the ruined, expensive meat, then up at Adriano's despairing, furious face. Her deep culinary instincts, honed through years of grinding poverty and making absolute magic out of nothing in cramped apartments, forcefully kicked in. She slapped her hand sharply against her own cheeks to snap out of the panic, taking a deep, fortifying breath. "No," she said firmly, her voice echoing with sudden authority in the large kitchen. "You are not losing this crucial alliance over a ruined piece of beef. Adriano, look at me." He slowly turned his dark, furious eyes to her. "I need you to trust me completely right now. Can you do that?" He stared at her fierce, determined expression, seeing the absolute fire in her eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "Get out there. Pour him your absolute best, oldest scotch. Talk about the old country. Stall him for exactly 1 hour." Leonie flew into immediate chaotic action. She entirely abandoned the concept of pretentious fine dining and embraced her rustic, soulful roots. She aggressively raided the dry pantry for the staples the saboteur hadn't bothered to touch. She grabbed massive, pungent Spanish onions, whole heads of garlic, the finest canned San Marzano tomatoes, and a cheap, tough cut of bone-in pork shoulder the guards usually used for their own basic meals. She worked like a woman possessed, utilizing a high-end pressure cooker to violently tenderize the stubborn pork in record time, creating a rich, deeply complex, wildly flavorful ragout. She rapidly hand-rolled fresh pappardelle pasta on the counter, her hands moving in a frantic, expert blur of flour and golden egg yolks. She didn't have edible gold leaf or rare truffles. She had raw heart, high heat, and deep soul. When the heavy dining room doors finally opened, Leonie wheeled out a simple, steaming, massive ceramic bowl of pasta al ragù di maiale. The opulent room fell instantly silent. Don Salvatore, a man incredibly used to beluga caviar and roasted quail, looked down at the highly rustic, peasant dish with severely raised, skeptical eyebrows. Adriano stiffened in his chair, holding his breath, his hand resting near his weapon. Leonie served the Don a generous, steaming portion herself. "With the utmost respect, Don Salvatore," she said smoothly, bowing her head slightly in traditional deference. "Mr. Romano insisted we bypass the meaningless fluff and serve you a dish that honors true, deep Italian heritage, not flashy modern trends. A meal of real substance for a man of substance." The Don looked at Adriano, then took a small, hesitant bite. He chewed very slowly. The room held its collective breath. He closed his ancient eyes. A single, genuine tear actually leaked from the old, hardened Mafia Boss's eye, rolling down his wrinkled cheek. "Mio Dio," he whispered hoarsely. "My grandmother. She used to make this exact dish in Napoli when I was a boy. I haven't tasted this in 60 years. He looked at Adriano, a wide, genuine, completely disarmed smile breaking across his weathered face. "Romano, you are a man who truly remembers his roots. You have my full alliance and my protection." And then he pointed his silver fork directly at Leonie. "And you, my dear, are an absolute angel." Adriano looked up at Leonie, his broad chest heaving slightly with an intense, overwhelming emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just immense gratitude. It was absolute, blinding awe. But as Leonie smiled back at him, feeling a flush of victory, Vincenzo stepped silently out of the dark shadows of the dining room, his face grim, and whispered something quietly in Adriano's ear that made the Don's blood instantly run cold. The vital alliance forged with Don Salvatore over a bowl of peasant pasta brought a much-needed, temporary halt to the street violence, allowing Adriano to safely return to Boston to directly manage his vast legitimate businesses the heavily sanitized front for his massive empire. To publicly cement his standing in high society and maintain his cover, he was required to attend the annual, incredibly lavish Hearts of Boston charity gala, an event swarming with multi-generational old money, corrupt politicians, and the glittering, entirely superficial elite he fundamentally despised. Leonie was dragged along, not at all as a guest, but strictly to oversee the catering staff from behind the scenes. Adriano had firmly insisted. His paranoia was so high, he no longer trusted anyone else with his food or drink. The grand ballroom of the historic hotel was a swirling sea of expensive silk, blinding diamonds, and toxic, hushed whispers. Leonie, dressed modestly in her standard black, double-breasted chef's uniform, stood uncomfortably near the bustling, swinging kitchen doors, ensuring the crystal champagne flutes were spotless and the delicate canapés were executed perfectly. She felt entirely, painfully out of place among the skeletal socialites and arrogant billionaires who looked right through her. Adriano was holding court across the vast room, looking devastatingly handsome and utterly lethal in a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He was naturally surrounded by a flock of desperate, beautiful women vying for his attention, including Isabella, a stunning, notoriously venomous runway model who had been one of the 10 immediately fired on Leonie's very first day. Isabella's father was a massive, wealthy real estate mogul Adriano did significant legitimate business with, making her cloying presence entirely unavoidable. Isabella, holding a flute of champagne like a scepter, noticed Adriano's dark eyes continually, distractedly drifting across the massive room, landing not on her plunging neckline, but on the chubby, plain-faced chef standing near the kitchen doors. A sharp, ugly jealousy flared hot in Isabella's chest. She abruptly excused herself from the circle and glided aggressively over to where Leonie stood, flanked by 2 giggling, equally thin friends. Well, well, Isabella purred loudly, looking Leonie up and down with exaggerated, theatrical disgust. I see the hired help is finally allowed out of the basement. Tell me, do you personally taste everything you cook before you serve it? Because looking at your waistline, it certainly looks like it. Her friends snickered loudly behind their crystal champagne glasses. Leonie felt a hot, deeply familiar flush of shame aggressively creep up her neck, hitting her absolute deepest, oldest insecurities about her body. She tightly squared her shoulders, fiercely refusing to let these superficial women see her bleed. My job is to ensure the food is exceptional, miss. Your job seems to be drinking entirely too much of it. Excuse me. She tried to step professionally around them to check on a tray, but Isabella deliberately blocked her path, intentionally knocking her sharp elbow hard into Leonie's arm. The heavy silver tray of delicate red wine braised short rib crostanis Leonie was holding tipped wildly, crashing violently to the marble floor and splattering dark, sticky sauce all across Leonie's crisp white apron and black trousers. "Oh, look!" Isabella mocked loudly, her voice intentionally drawing the attention of dozens of nearby wealthy guests. The fat cow is incredibly clumsy, too. Adriano must only keep you around purely out of charity, or pity. Hot tears stung Leonie's eyes, blurring her vision. The cruel whispers in the room rapidly grew louder. She bent down quickly to pick up the broken glass, her hands shaking violently, feeling smaller and more humiliated than she ever had in her entire life. Suddenly, the ambient, buzzing chatter in the entire ballroom died completely. The heavy, terrified silence spread rapidly outward from the center of the room like a physical shockwave. Adriano had seen. He moved purposefully across the ballroom with the smooth, predatory grace of a hunting panther. His handsome face a mask of absolute, terrifying, cold fury. The wealthy crowd parted for him instinctively, some people physically stepping back in fear. He stopped dead in front of Isabella, who who excitedly puffed out her chest, smiling coquettishly, foolishly thinking he had come to greet her. Adriano didn't even glance at her. He knelt gracefully, ruining the crease of his tuxedo pants, directly onto the ruined floor, gently taking the sharp, broken glass from Leonie's trembling hands. He pulled a pristine, monogrammed silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and gently, tenderly wiped a single drop of dark sauce from her wrist. "Adriano?" Isabella asked, her arrogant smile faltering slightly at his strange behavior. She spilled. Adriano stood up slowly to his full, imposing height, positioning his large frame completely in front of Leonie, physically shielding her from the room's stares. He finally turned his dead gaze to Isabella, and the absolute, murderous darkness in his eyes made the confident model instinctively take a terrified step back. "Isabella!" Adriano's voice was perfectly, chillingly calm, which made it all the more horrifying to anyone who truly knew him. "Your father's highly lucrative lease on the waterfront properties is up for renewal next month. As of tonight, it is permanently cancelled. His loans will be called in by morning. Your family is entirely ruined." Isabella paled instantly, gasping as if struck. "What? You can't be serious? You're destroying my family over her?" Adriano stepped closer, his deep voice carrying clearly over the dead silent, breathless ballroom. "You dare speak to her? You dare stand in her presence and attempt to insult her? Leonie possesses more raw intelligence, pure talent, and actual worth in a single breath than you will ever achieve in a lifetime of starving yourself." He reached back and wrapped a fiercely protective, heavy arm around Leonie's shoulders, pulling her tight against his side. "She is not the help. She is the absolute heart of my household. And if anyone in this entire room ever disrespects her again, you will answer to me, personally and violently." He turned away from the trembling, sobbing model and looked down at Leonie. The terrifying coldness vanished from his face entirely, replaced by a fierce, intensely possessive warmth that made Leonie's breath catch. "Let's go home, Leonie." He walked her confidently out of the grand gala, leaving a stunned, utterly terrified Boston high society in their wake. In the back of the heavily armored Maybach, driving through the dark city streets, the silence was incredibly thick. Leonie stared blankly out the tinted window, her heart racing frantically, trying to process the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. "You didn't have to ruin her entire family's livelihood," Leonie whispered into the quiet car, her voice tight with emotion. "You didn't have to defend me like that. I can handle mean girls. I've dealt with them my whole life." Adriano reached smoothly across the dark, expensive leather seat, his large, incredibly warm hand gently gripping her chin, firmly turning her face toward him in the dim light. "You shouldn't have to handle them. Not anymore. Not while I breathe." His thumb brushed lightly, agonizingly slow over her lower lip, his dark eyes searching hers with a desperate, naked intensity. "I didn't do it out of pity, Leonie. I did it because—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening painfully, the heavy words trapped securely behind 20 years of emotional, defensive barriers. He pulled his hand back as if burned, staring intensely out the opposite window into the rainy night. "Just don't ever let anyone make you feel small. Ever." Leonie touched her own chin where his rough fingers had burned her skin. She realized, with a terrifying, heart-stopping jolt, that she was falling deeply, dangerously, and irreversibly in love with the most feared, lethal man in Boston. But the very next morning, her blossoming world was thrown completely back into terrifying chaos when a tiny, highly advanced hidden microphone fell from the underside of the kitchen island she was vigorously cleaning. The horrifying discovery of the listening device, securely fastened beneath the kitchen island, instantly shattered the incredibly fragile, beautiful piece Leonie had just begun to build with Adriano. It was tiny, black, highly sophisticated, and terrifyingly clear evidence that the treacherous mole was not just out in the vast syndicate, but operating intimately, dangerously close within the household itself. She didn't go to Adriano immediately. She knew exactly how his terrifying temper operated. If she blindly handed him the bug, he would violently lock down the entire estate and likely execute half his staff in the basement on pure suspicion alone. Instead, Leonie took a deep breath and used the one incredibly sharp weapon she possessed, her brain. She took the device to the bright light of the window and closely examined it. It was faintly coated in a sticky residue of what initially looked like powdered sugar. But when she brought it to her nose, it smelled distinctly, faintly, of bitter almonds. Her sharp culinary mind raced through possibilities. Almond extract? No, it was thicker, sweeter. It was a very specific, highly expensive type of marzipan paste used exclusively in traditional Sicilian baking. A paste she knew only one, very traditional bakery in the old North End, imported directly from Italy. That sunny afternoon, under the highly plausible guise of desperately needing to source specialty ingredients for the week's menus, Leonie took the massive, armored SUV and 2 heavily armed guards down to the bustling North End market. She casually, smoothly slipped away from her escort while the guards were entirely distracted by a staged, incredibly loud shouting match she had secretly paid a street vendor $100 to start. She slipped quietly into the dark, damp alleyway directly behind Pasticceria Rossi. Creeping silently toward the slightly cracked, grease-stained window of the back prep room, she held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. Inside, aggressively arguing in hushed, furious Sicilian dialect, were 2 men. One was a known, heavily tattooed lieutenant from the rival Moretti family. The other was Vincenzo. Leonie's blood instantly ran ice-cold. Vincenzo, Adriano's trusted right hand, the very man who had welcomed her to the estate, the man who meticulously managed every single aspect of Adriano's security and life. Romano is incredibly weak right now. Vincenzo was snarling angrily, slamming his fist on a flowery table. He's entirely distracted by that fat, useless chef. He's talking about going completely legitimate behind our backs, giving up the docks. We strike tomorrow night when he moves the primary weapons shipment to the secondary warehouse. I'll personally ensure his personal guard is reduced to a skeleton crew. Leonie clamped both hands tightly over her mouth to muffle a horrified gasp. She had to warn Adriano immediately, but as she took a panicked step backward in the alley, her heavy boot crunched incredibly loudly on a discarded, broken cannoli shell. The angry arguing inside stopped instantly. "Who's out there?" Vincenzo barked sharply, the sound of a gun racking echoing clearly. Leonie didn't think. She sprinted. She ran harder and faster than she ever had in her entire life, her lungs burning with the cold air, weaving erratically through the dizzying, confusing labyrinth of ancient alleys until she finally burst out onto the crowded main street, practically colliding head-on with her panicked, searching bodyguards. "Get me back to the penthouse. Now drive!" she commanded, her voice cracking with sheer terror. She burst frantically into Adriano's private, heavily guarded office 40 minutes later, completely bypassing his stunned, protesting secretaries. Adriano looked up angrily from his heavy paperwork, deeply annoyed at the sudden intrusion, but his expression instantly morphed into pure, terrifying alarm when he saw her pale, sweat-drenched face and shaking hands. "Leonie, what happened? Are you hurt?" He was on his feet in a microsecond, effortlessly crossing the large room to grip her arms tightly, his dark eyes frantically scanning her body for any signs of injury or blood. "It's Vincenzo," she gasped out, gripping his expensive suit lapels desperately to steady her shaking legs. "He's the mole, Adriano. I heard him myself at Rossi's bakery. They're hitting the weapons transport tomorrow night. He's intentionally thinning your security. He planted the bug in my kitchen. He deliberately sabotaged the dinner with the Don." Adriano froze completely. A terrifying, deadly calm settled heavily over him, chilling the room. It was somehow much worse than his explosive rage. The older man who had practically raised him in the Mafia after his own father died was actively, maliciously betraying him. "Are you absolutely, entirely certain of what you heard?" he asked, his voice completely dead, entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes, they specifically mentioned me. Vincenzo said I'm making you incredibly weak." She looked down at the floor, suddenly deeply ashamed and feeling entirely out of place in his violent world. "Maybe they're right. I'm just a distraction, a liability." Adriano gripped her chin firmly, physically forcing her to look up and meet his gaze. The intense fire in his dark eyes was blinding, possessing. "You are not a weakness, Leonie. You are the only real, pure thing in my entire life. You are my absolute clarity." He pulled his encrypted phone from his pocket, dialing a number without looking away from her. "Marco, assemble the Alpha Strike team immediately. Do not tell Vincenzo a single word, and double the armed guard on Leonie. If a single hair on her head is harmed today, I will personally burn this entire city to the ground." He hung up the phone abruptly and looked back at her, his hard expression slowly softening into something incredibly raw, desperate, and vulnerable. "You actively risked your own life to spy on the mob to find this out. Why would you do that?" "Because," Leonie breathed, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, her walls entirely coming down. "I care about you, Adriano, more than I ever should." The heavy tension finally snapped. Adriano moved instantly, pulling her forcefully, flush against his broad chest, burying his face deep in her messy hair, inhaling the scent of vanilla and flour. He held her so tightly she could feel the heavy, frantic thud of his heartbeat racing against her own. For a long, beautiful moment, they just stood there tightly embraced, finding a desperately needed anchor in each other amidst the swirling chaos of his world. But Vincenzo was a highly seasoned, cunning mobster. By the time Adriano's most loyal men heavily breached the bakery to arrest him, Vincenzo had entirely vanished into the wind, leaving a single, chilling, handwritten note pinned to the wall with a knife. "She will heavily burn for your sins, boy." The long, agonizing week following Vincenzo's shocking disappearance was a waking, suffocating nightmare. Adriano locked down the compound completely, turning it into an impenetrable fortress. He abruptly moved Leonie out of the comfortable staff quarters and directly into the massive master suite right next to his own, posting 2 heavily armed, silent guards at her door, 24/7. He was entirely consumed by a dark, obsessive, terrifying need to protect her at all costs, pushing away the softer man she had started to love, and entirely reverting to the cold, calculating, deeply paranoid Mafia Don. Leonie felt utterly suffocated. She wasn't allowed in the kitchen alone anymore. Every single thing she cooked was rigidly taste-tested by a grim-faced guard before it left the room. The deep, profound joy of her craft was rapidly dying under the crushing weight of his paranoia. It culminated on a bleak, freezing Thursday evening. Adriano had called an emergency, high-stakes meeting of his top, most trusted capos in the grand dining room to entirely restructure his compromised defenses. Leonie had lovingly prepared a simple, highly elegant ossobuco, hoping the comfort food would ease the tension. She proudly served the plates herself, desperately craving some small semblance of normalcy. As Adriano picked up his heavy silver fork to take the very first bite, one of the older capos, a severely sneering, bitter man named Rossi, who had always been deeply loyal to Vincenzo, suddenly stood up, knocking his chair back. "Don't eat that, boss!" Rossi barked loudly, pointing an accusing finger at the meat. Adriano paused, his dark eyes instantly narrowing into dangerous slits. "Explain yourself," Rossi sneered directly at Leonie, his eyes full of hatred. "We just intercepted a coded message from Vincenzo's camp. He heavily bragged that he didn't need to mount a frontal attack to kill us. He said his sweet little baker was going to finish the job for him from the inside." Rossi triumphantly pulled a small, clear glass vial from his suit pocket and slammed it on the table. "We searched her room. We found this hidden deep in her personal spice rack. Highly concentrated digitalis, foxglove extract. It perfectly mimics a massive natural heart attack and is almost entirely untraceable." Leonie dropped the heavy silver serving tray with a deafening, terrifying crash that echoed off the stone walls. "What? No, that's an absolute lie. I have no idea what that is. I've never seen it before." The room instantly erupted into chaos. Heavy guns were aggressively drawn and pointed directly at her. Adriano sat completely, unnervingly still at the head of the table, staring at the vial, then slowly down at his plate, and finally at Leonie's horrified face. His face was a perfectly blank mask of unreadable, terrifying stone. "Adriano, please!" Leonie begged, hot tears instantly springing to her eyes, her voice cracking in terror. "You know me. You know my heart. I would never, ever hurt you. He maliciously planted it. Vincenzo's men planted it before he left to frame me." Adriano slowly stood up. The silence in the room instantly became absolute, suffocating. He looked deeply at the beautiful woman who had brought light into his incredibly dark world. He saw her genuine terror, her absolute honesty. He knew, deep in his very soul, she was entirely innocent. But as he subtly shifted his gaze, he also saw the hungry, highly suspicious, violent eyes of his top capos. If he showed even a fraction of weakness, if he blindly protected a mere woman over hard evidence of high treason, a bloody mutiny would instantly tear his entire family apart. Vincenzo had engineered an absolutely perfect unsolvable trap: force the Don to be murdered, or force the Don to publicly destroy his own heart. Adriano's sharp tactical mind raced frantically, formulating a desperate, incredibly agonizing plan. He had to publicly play the monster, to safely smuggle her out alive. "Take her!" Adriano commanded loudly, his voice completely devoid of any human emotion, cold as ice. "No!" Leonie screamed in absolute agony as two large, rough guards violently grabbed her arms. "Adriano, look at me! Please don't do this!" Adriano walked slowly around the table, stopping inches from her face. He saw the profound, absolute heartbreak entirely shattering her beautiful hazel eyes, and it took every single ounce of his immense willpower not to pull his gun and kill the guards holding her. "You are officially stripped of your position," he said loudly, coldly, projecting his voice for the entire room to hear. "You are permanently banished from my territory. If I ever see your lying face in Boston again, you will not survive the night. Throw her out into the cold." "Adriano!" she sobbed brokenly, as they dragged her roughly backward toward the heavy wooden doors. "You promised me. You explicitly said I was your clarity." "I was terribly wrong," he lied smoothly, his own dark heart violently tearing into 1,000 unfixable pieces as the heavy door slammed shut, aggressively cutting off her desperate cries. He waited patiently until she was entirely gone from the property, until the capos muttered their deep approval of his utter ruthlessness. Then, when the room cleared, Adriano turned to his most trusted, completely silent personal bodyguard, Marco. "Follow her immediately," Adriano whispered, so softly only Marco could hear, his voice finally breaking slightly with grief. "Set her up securely in a highly fortified safe house in Vermont. Bankroll her entirely, every penny she needs, but do not ever let her know it's me. Guard her with your very life. If she dies, you die. And Rossi?" Marco nodded grimly, understanding perfectly. "Take Rossi directly to the basement," Adriano said, his eyes turning black with rage. "He's Vincenzo's man. He obviously planted the vial. Get him to talk, then bury him where no one will ever find him." Adriano was left entirely alone in the massive, silent dining room. He looked down at the cold plate of beautiful ossobuco she had lovingly made for him. He sat down heavily, picked up his fork, and deliberately took a large bite of the supposedly poisoned food. It tasted only like ash, dust, and profound regret. He had successfully saved her life, but he knew with absolute certainty he had completely, irreparably destroyed her heart. 6 long, incredibly agonizing months later, the sprawling Romano estate was entirely dead. Oh, it was heavily, perfectly guarded, incredibly efficient, and highly lethal, but it had absolutely no soul left. Without the warm smell of roasting garlic, without the soft sound of humming echoing from the kitchen, without Leonie's bright smile, the massive stone house was just a beautiful, expensive tomb. Adriano had entirely become a ghost of a man. He had spent the last 6 relentless months violently, systematically dismantling the Moretti family with a terrifying, clinical, surgical precision that shocked the underworld. He had personally hunted down Vincenzo and ended the threat permanently, with extreme prejudice. But his ultimate victory felt entirely hollow. He now sat completely uncontested at the very head of the East Coast underworld, entirely untouched, and completely, devastatingly alone. He couldn't sleep for more than an hour a night. He could barely eat. He had aggressively fired 3 more highly trained chefs. No one could successfully replicate her delicate touch. No one could ever replicate her. Far away, in a small, deeply snowy, picturesque town in Vermont, Leonie was flourishing outwardly, though her warm smile never quite reached her sad eyes. She had used her mysterious savings to open a tiny, highly rustic bakery, beautifully named Lievito. The friendly locals enthusiastically lined up down the block every morning for her incredible sourdough, warm focaccia, and sweet cannolis. She had barely survived the crushing heartbreak, violently throwing all her grief and tears directly into her dough. She firmly believed Adriano had ruthlessly discarded her like common trash. She never knew about the silent, heavily armed Marco watching her every move from the shadows, or the completely anonymous trust fund that quietly paid her commercial rent. One bleak Tuesday afternoon, as a heavy snowstorm rolled in, Leonie was quietly wiping down the wooden front counter, lost in thought. The small brass bell above the glass door chimed brightly. She didn't look up immediately, continuing to scrub a stubborn flour stain. "Welcome in. Just a quick heads up. We're entirely sold out of the almond croissants for the day, but the rosemary focaccia is still warm." She stopped dead. The very air in the small bakery had suddenly, drastically grown incredibly heavy, thick with a deeply familiar, highly dangerous gravity that made her skin prickle. She slowly looked up. Adriano stood just inside the closed door. He wore a heavy, expensive black wool overcoat, white snowflakes melting rapidly in his dark, slightly longer hair. He looked noticeably older, visibly thinner, and the dark, bruised circles under his eyes were more prominent than ever. But when he looked at her, His dark eyes burned with a desperate, deeply starving intensity that paralyzed her. Leonie dropped her damp rag. Her breath hitched violently, a painful, incredibly confusing mixture of sudden terror, deep anger, and an undeniable, overwhelming longing violently twisting in her chest. "We're closed," she whispered, her voice shaking badly, backing away slightly. "You explicitly told me if you ever saw my face again." "I lied," Adriano said, his deep voice cracking with raw emotion. He took a slow, hesitant step toward her, holding his hands up placatingly. "I entirely lied to keep you alive. Rossi was secretly working for Vincenzo. If I hadn't banished you publicly in front of the capos, they would have successfully assassinated you that very night. I sent Marco to fiercely protect you. I've actively watched over you every single day for 6 months." Leonie stared at him, the massive revelation hitting her like a severe physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. "You lied to me? You broke my heart into 1,000,000 tiny pieces. You let me genuinely believe you thought I was a cold-blooded murderer. As a tactical strategy?" Pure anger, incredibly hot and bright, flared up violently, instantly overriding her unshed tears. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to play God with my life and my emotions, Adriano. I had absolutely no other choice," he yelled back, the polished, stoic Mafia Boss facade completely breaking down into raw desperation. "I was losing everything. The only thing I deeply cared about was making sure you kept breathing. I would infinitely rather you hate me from afar than love me in a closed casket." He quickly crossed the small room in 3 long strides, stopping just on the other side of the wooden counter. He looked down at her, his broad, intimidating shoulders slumping completely in utter defeat. "The bloody war is completely over, Leonie," he said softly, his voice full of a bone-deep exhaustion. "Vincenzo is gone. The Morettis are entirely done. I made it safe for you. But I can't survive in that massive house without you. I genuinely can't breathe without you. I have all the power in the entire world, and I am standing here begging you. Please come back to me." Leonie tightly gripped the edge of the wooden counter, her knuckles turning white, fiercely fighting the desperate urge to reach out and touch his tired, beautiful face. She loved him. God, she still loved him so much it hurt. But she knew the terrifying, bloody reality of his world. "I can't, Adriano," she whispered, a single hot tear slipping down her pale cheek. "I simply can't live locked in a stone fortress. I can't cook with heavily armed guards constantly watching my every move. I can't wake up every single day terrified, wondering if you're going to come home in a body bag, or if you're going to arbitrarily banish me again to protect me. I am a simple baker. I desperately need sunlight and profound peace and actual freedom. Your world is entirely too dark for me to survive in." Adriano stared deeply at her, the absolute, crushing finality in her tearful voice devastating him completely. He nodded slowly, a profound, heavy sorrow settling permanently over his sharp features. "I understand," he whispered brokenly. He turned around slowly and walked heavily out the glass door, the small brass bell chiming a mournful, final goodbye into the snow. Leonie collapsed heavily against the counter, sobbing violently into her hands until her ribs ached. She genuinely thought she had seen the absolute last of Adriano Romano. She was entirely wrong. A very long, painful month passed. Leonie tried desperately to bury herself entirely in her demanding work, kneading dough until her shoulders screamed, but the warm bakery felt incredibly cold and empty. She had fiercely demanded peace, but without Adriano's intense presence, the peace felt exactly like a dark void. One bright Tuesday morning, She tiredly opened the local Boston newspaper Marco still secretly had delivered to her door. The massive, bold front-page headline made her drop her hot coffee mug, shattering it on the floor. Romano Syndicate, dismantled. Feared Boston kingpin transfers all illegal assets. Turns state's evidence in historic immunity deal. Leonie rapidly skimmed the long, detailed article, her flour-covered hands shaking violently. Adriano had actually done the absolutely impossible. He had systematically, entirely dismantled his own massive criminal empire. He had willingly handed over highly lucrative shipping routes to the federal authorities, permanently liquidated dozens of underground casinos, and brilliantly transitioned his entire massive organization into a highly legitimate, heavily taxed olive oil import and commercial real estate corporation. He had officially stepped down as Don. He had completely surrendered his crown. Later that same sunny afternoon, a sleek, black, but notably unarmored normal sedan pulled up quietly outside Lievito. Adriano stepped out. He wasn't wearing a dark, highly intimidating, expensive suit. He wore a simple, soft beige fisherman's sweater, dark, fitted jeans and worn boots. He looked physically lighter. The crushing, suffocating weight of extreme paranoia seemed to have been entirely lifted from his broad shoulders. He walked slowly into the bakery. Leonie was completely paralyzed behind the pastry case, the crumpled newspaper clutched tightly in her hand. "You completely stepped down," she breathed, her eyes wide with shock. "You gave it all up. You could easily be killed. Your enemies..." "My enemies are currently rotting in federal prison, or they are doing highly legitimate, boring business with my new corporation," Adriano said calmly, walking steadily up to the counter. "I strategically gave the feds just enough evidence to easily secure total immunity for my loyal men and entirely dismantle the rest. It took a solid month of non-stop legal work to finalize the paperwork." He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a small, highly worn, incredibly fragile, leather-bound notebook. He placed it gently, reverently, on the glass counter. Leonie recognized it immediately. It was his late mother's handwritten recipe book, the only physical thing in the world he truly treasured. "You explicitly said my world was entirely too dark for you," Adriano said, looking deeply into her stunned eyes, his voice steady. "So I burned it entirely to the ground. I don't have a massive mafia empire anymore, Leonie. I just have a highly profitable import business, a very quiet, sunny house in the country. And this." He tapped the old notebook gently. Leonie was utterly speechless. Men like the terrifying Adriano Romano simply didn't change. They categorically didn't surrender ultimate power, but he had violently ripped out the entire, deeply rooted foundation of his life, simply because it couldn't successfully hold her. "I genuinely don't know how to be a normal man," Adriano admitted quietly, a rare, incredibly self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "I don't know how to properly date a woman. I don't know how to do any of this civilian life. But I desperately want to learn. I want to wake up in the bright sun. I want to eat your incredible food without someone tasting it for poison first. I just want you." He walked slowly around the edge of the counter, fully entering her personal space. He didn't aggressively grab her. He stood very close, offering himself entirely, patiently waiting for her permission. "I bought a beautiful storefront in Boston," he continued softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Right in the heart of the North End. Massive glass windows, lots of warm sunlight. Absolutely perfect for a flagship restaurant. I desperately need an executive chef, and I deeply need a partner in absolutely everything." Leonie looked up at the once terrifying, deeply beautiful man who had willingly laid his entire massive world at her flower-covered feet. She saw the absolute vulnerability he only ever showed her. She reached out slowly, her flour-dusted hands gently, lovingly cupping his strong jaw. He instantly leaned heavily into her warm touch, closing his dark eyes with a long, shuddering sigh of absolute, profound relief. "You really burned down your entire empire just for me?" she whispered, happy tears rapidly pooling in her hazel eyes. Adriano opened his eyes, gently placing his large, warm hands over hers. "You are my entire empire, Leonie. You always have been, ever since the very moment you fearlessly yelled at me for buying bad produce." Leonie let out a watery, joyful laugh, pulling his face down to hers. When their lips finally met, it wasn't just a brief spark. It was a slow, deeply simmering, incredibly warm fire. It tasted faintly of salt, happy tears, and a profound, completely unbreakable promise. He kissed her deeply, with the desperate, religious reverence of a starving man who had finally, truly found sustenance. "So," Adriano whispered breathlessly against her lips, resting his forehead against hers, "will you finally teach me how to properly bake bread?" "Only if you strictly follow all of my rules," she smiled widely, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. "I wouldn't ever dare break them," he promised softly. 3 incredibly fast, joyous years later, the highly anticipated grand opening of Il Cuore, the Heart, in Boston's bustling North End, was the ultimate culinary event of the entire decade. The restaurant was absolutely stunning. Soaring high ceilings, massive floor-to-ceiling windows, pouring warm, golden sunlight directly onto rustic, hand-carved wooden tables, and a massive, gleaming open kitchen where guests could clearly see the culinary magic happen. Leonie, now proudly Leonie Romano, stood confidently at the busy pass, expertly and meticulously inspecting plates of perfect, hand-rolled orecchiette before they went out to the packed dining room. She wore a pristine, highly tailored white chef's coat that perfectly hugged her beautiful curves, with her new name elegantly embroidered in gold thread directly over her heart. She was absolutely glowing, fiercely confident, and undeniably the beloved queen of her domain. Adriano walked casually up behind her, wrapping his strong arms lovingly around her waist and resting his chin happily on her shoulder. He wore a sharp, expensive tailored suit, but the terrifying, oppressive aura of the Don was completely gone. He was smiling, a genuine, warm, deeply relaxed smile. He was now the highly successful CEO of Romano Imports, proudly providing his wife's restaurant with the absolute finest ingredients in the world. The notoriously harsh food critics at Table 4 are literally weeping over the espresso tiramisu, Adriano murmured happily, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin of her neck. "Good," Leonie laughed brightly, leaning comfortably back against his solid chest, completely at home in his arms. "I deliberately doubled the espresso just for them. Are you hungry? You've been aggressively schmoozing wealthy investors all night. I'm absolutely starved," he admitted honestly, his stomach rumbling. "But I don't want anything fancy off the main menu. Make me the stew, the rustic pork stew from the very first day you stormed into my life." Leonie turned fully in his arms, smiling brightly up at her handsome husband. The intensely paranoid man who was once a cold ghost, hopelessly trapped in a dark, violent fortress, was now a vibrant, deeply loving, incredibly supportive partner. They had successfully built a beautiful life entirely on mutual respect, deep trust, and a shared, profound love for the simple, beautiful things in life. One highly rustic, completely unpretentious stew, coming right up, Mr. Romano, she teased gently, tapping his nose with a floury finger. "I love you," he said, suddenly incredibly serious, his dark eyes filled with absolute, unwavering adoration. More than life itself. I love you too, Adriano. Now get out of my busy kitchen before I actually put you to work aggressively washing the dishes. He laughed loudly, an incredibly rich, deep sound that still consistently gave her butterflies, and stepped happily out into the bustling, noisy dining room to warmly greet their friends. Leonie watched him go, her heart overwhelmingly, joyously full. She had taken a terrified, deeply broken, incredibly violent man, and successfully showed him that the greatest power in the world wasn't found in fear, but in unconditional love, and Adriano had beautifully shown her that she was absolutely worth moving mountains, or completely dismantling entire empires, to keep. Together, through storms and flour, they had perfectly found the ultimate recipe for a beautiful life. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I truly hope you enjoyed the deep, emotional journey of Adriano and Leonie. This heavily expanded story beautifully reminds us that true strength isn't at all about power, violence, intimidation, or the massive defensive walls we desperately build around ourselves to keep from getting hurt. True, lasting strength is found deeply in vulnerability, in the incredible courage it takes to completely change our path, and in recognizing the profound, undeniable worth in people who might not fit society's superficial, highly toxic molds. Leonie wasn't just an incredibly talented chef. She was the absolute catalyst for a deeply broken man to fully reclaim his lost humanity. If this emotional, highly descriptive, slow-burn romance touched your heart today, please be sure to leave a like on the video and share your specific thoughts in the comments below. What was your absolute favorite, most emotional moment between the fiercely protective mafia boss and the brilliant, resilient chef? Don't forget to fiercely hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never, ever miss a completely original, deeply emotional storytelling experience on this channel. Your continued, wonderful support means the absolute world to me and allows me to keep passionately writing these unique, long-form tales for you to relax, unwind, and fully escape into. Until next time, stay safe, eat good food, and always remember that sometimes the most extraordinary, life-changing love is found in the absolute most unexpected places. End of story.